There are 7 iconic powers to obtain throughout your playthrough of Final Fantasy XVI, with each of them granting Clive a new iconic feat, along with combat abilities to unlock in the skill tree. Clive can only equip 3 iconic feats at a time, making it difficult to choose between the 7 powers. Iconic abilities, however, can be intermixed between feats, so long as you have the ability mastered in the skill tree. Today's video will dive into the Phoenix Shift, Deadly Embrace, and Blind Justice. We'll break down their use case in combat, along with the unique combat abilities from their respective icons, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to master any of these 3 icons. The later game icons will be discussed in a future video, but for now, my name is Atano, and this is part 1 of mastering every iconic power in Final Fantasy XVI. We start the game off with the Blessing of the Phoenix, which imbues a few of Clive's basic attacks with the element of fire, along with providing us some rudimentary iconic abilities. Their iconic feat, Phoenix Shift, is easily a standout ability in the game, and if you played Final Fantasy XV, it might remind you of Noctis's Warp Strike, as they're very similar in functionality. Clive can use it to quickly shift towards enemies, mitigating any gaps during combat, while afterwards performing either a Shift Strike or Shift Shot. The shifting period can also be used to buffer the charge up of Burning Blade or Charged Magic for a quick and easy follow-up. However, if you don't utilize the buffer period, Shift Strike can easily be turned into a full Magic Burst combo, while a Shift Shot can lift down enemies for starting another Magic Burst combo. Shift Strike acts the same when used on airborne enemies, but an aerial Shift Shot will instead knock enemies straight to the ground for Clive to shift towards and punish. Alternatively, you can hold your magic input button during the Shift Shot to buffer charged magic for bringing the enemy back into the air after they've been knocked down. Phoenix Shift's warp distance can also be increased by mastering the ability in the skill tree. This upgrade makes a noticeable difference and helps with some of the earlier boss fights, so I'd recommend upgrading it at your soonest opportunity. Now onto the Phoenix's iconic abilities. The best way to describe them is that they are rudimentary and serve the purpose of introducing the player to the combat system. Their damage and willpower are average, ranging anywhere from 2 to 3 stars for either stat. Rising Flames will be helpful for launching smaller enemies into the air with a buffered charged magic to start aerial combos. The recovery time after Rising Flames is also shorter than some other iconic abilities, so you can quickly perform follow-up attacks on the ground if aerial combat isn't really your thing. Scarlet Cyclone sees Clive spread the wings of the Phoenix all around him in a 360 sweeping motion, damaging and knocking back close by enemies. Plus, if this ability is executed while Clive is being knocked back by an enemy attack, it will deal increased damage and have a shorter cooldown of only 10 seconds compared to the standard 30 seconds. Heatwave is one of the Phoenix's more unique abilities since it has its own parry mechanic against projectiles. If activated just before an enemy projectile hits Clive, a wall of fire will block the projectile while in return buffing the subsequent heat waves launched towards the enemy. The ability's cooldown will also be reduced to only 8 seconds compared to its standard 25 seconds. You can once again follow up Heatwave with a buffered charged magic to launch enemies high into the air for aerial combos, or even use Garuda's Deadly Embrace to bring them back to Clive for more groundwork. Flames of Rebirth is Phoenix's signature ability that packs quite a punch, dealing the most damage out of all their abilities while also replenishing some of Clive's health as a bonus. This added strength obviously comes at a cost, seeing that it has a lengthy cooldown coming in at 2 minutes, so be strategic when you decide to use it, like after reaching the 1.5 damage multiplier against a fully staggered enemy. And don't worry about the enemy exiting the staggered state during the ability's long animation, as their stagger bar freezes during the entirety of the attack, so you can wait up until the last second to use it. So those are the abilities of the Phoenix, but once you reach a certain point in the game's story, you'll unlock abilities from the Eikon Ifrit. These abilities are attached to Phoenix Shift and can't be moved around until you master them, so I figured they're worth discussing. Ignition sends Clive rushing forward, scooping up smaller enemies while dealing continuous damage to them. It's perfect for taking on larger groups, plus it can be activated when airborne. You can combine it with the Will of the Wykes ability to rack up some additional damage and block any incoming attacks which Ignition leaves you susceptible to. Will of the Wykes is one of the more complex abilities in the game, and if you haven't played around with it much, I definitely recommend it. When activated, Clive summons multiple orbiting fireballs that deal minor damage as well as protect Clive from up to 4 enemy attacks. Think of it as a constant buff for close quarters combat and as a shield that provides temporary invulnerability, but its use case goes beyond this, and you'll find that it can sometimes juggle smaller enemies directly in front of Clive and prevent them from being knocked back by Clive's finishing moves like Magic Burst. This feature doesn't seem to work all the time, however, but it works well enough for me to feel like mentioning it. Trying to parry enemy attacks is also much safer with Will-o'-the-Wisps activated, since if you miss the parry window, you won't receive any damage or get staggered from the enemy attack. And finally, we already know that Phoenix Shift renders Clive invisible, but that doesn't mean he's invincible. His hitbox is still present while shifting, and he can still get damaged by attacks, but with Will-o'-the-Wisps activated, damage can be avoided altogether. You'll find this ability's combat potential expand extensively the more iconic powers you unlock in the game, like with Garuda's Gouge or even Ramuh's Lightning Rod. If you've been enjoying the video here so far and finding it informative, consider subscribing down below as it really helps out my growing channel. Okay, now let's jump into Garuda's Deadly Embrace, which acts as a perfect opposite to Phoenix Shift. Deadly Embrace launches out a claw towards a distant enemy, pulling them directly in front of Clive, also mitigating any gaps during a fight like Phoenix Shift. If used on larger enemies, however, Clive will instead perform a Deadly Leap, launching himself into the air spinning while also dealing AoE damage to enemies within distance. You can use Deadly Leap for easy back-to-back down thrusts or even as an evasion method. Stomps also work great alongside the Deadly Leap, especially if you want to achieve the most airtime for aerial combos. Furthermore, when a larger enemy becomes partially staggered, you can quickly use Deadly Embrace to grab them and topple them to the ground for a deadly takedown. Enemies will be immobile for roughly 5 seconds, and all of Clive's attacks will see a 5% damage increase during this period. The 5% damage buff during this period is pretty negligible if I'm being honest, as something like Gouge's total damage output will only be increased from 1874 up to 1967. The main benefit of the Deadly Takedown isn't necessarily for its damage boost, but instead for creating a window where Clive can freely deal damage against a larger enemy without needing to worry about their incoming attacks. Longer boss fights benefit from this tactic the most to give yourself a short break from the constant barrage of attacks coming Clive's way. Now for Garuda's iconic abilities. Their main strength doesn't lie in their raw damage output, but instead in their willpower and sheer speed. All of her abilities are multi-hit attacks that hit with extreme efficiency. Wicked Wheel is essential for aerial combat as it lifts Clive upward along with smaller enemies caught by its claws. It acts as a great buffer period for both Burning Blade and Charged Magic as the enemy is left directly in front of Clive after its final hit. You can use Deadly Embrace after the Charged Magic shot to pull the enemy back to Clive for ending the air combo with a down thrust. Next is Garuda's Gouge, and it's one of the best abilities in the early to mid game for depleting an enemy's will bar at a very fast pace. It's a 16 multi-hit ability with the first 3 slashes along with its final slash dealing the most damage. It can be used on the ground or when airborne, making the ability fairly versatile. Gouge is one of the lengthier abilities that can leave you vulnerable to incoming attacks, however it can be cancelled with an evade anytime after the first 2 slashes. But an even better option than evading is to cancel it with Rook's Gambit, and if you time your execution properly, you'll get an awesome precision attack that deals increased damage and willpower. This is a pretty solid combo for depleting a portion of an enemy's will bar, as Gouge and Rook's Gambit combined deal very quick and high willpower. Throw in a Wicked Wheel at the end of this combo and you'll be very close to partially staggering some enemies. Lastly is Garuda's signature ability, Aerial Blast. The acrobatics performed by Clive at the start of this attack are pretty sweet, and the ability itself deals solid willpower against larger enemies. Smaller enemies become engulfed in the tornado and are dealt continuous damage while being susceptible to any ranged iconic abilities Clive may currently have at his disposal. Some good ones to use are Ramuh's Thunderstorm or even the later Bahamut's Impulse. It's obvious that Garuda's strength lies in her sheer speed and aerial prowess, but meshing these strengths with the Phoenix's well-rounded groundwork and gap-closing Phoenix Shift creates a force to be reckoned with. Together they act like a yin and yang, allowing Clive to chain together some pretty stylish combos early on in the game, and it proves just how complex the game's combat system will soon become the further you progress in the story. Last and certainly not least is Ramuh's Blind Justice. This feat is distinctly different from Phoenix Shift and Deadly Embrace by allowing Clive to target up to 9 enemies and launch at them a barrage of ball lightning. The ball lightning will affix themselves to the targeted enemies and stay attached for 30 seconds before disappearing. But if Clive damages any of the enemies during this 30-second period, the ball lightning will discharge on every target, dealing additional damage. Discharge damage is relative to the number of ball lightning Clive sends out when activating Blind Justice, along with the type of attack used to trigger it and the stats of Clive's equipped weapon. This means you should send out the maximum number of ball lightning possible, whether that be 6 or 9 depending on your upgrade level. Plus, Clive's melee attacks should always be used to then trigger the discharge, since magic attacks are significantly weaker. You can see here the clear damage difference between a magic and melee discharge, with the melee discharge dealing double the amount of damage. Magic and melee iconic abilities can also trigger a discharge, but unfortunately deal no additional damage. I feel this was a missed opportunity and could have significantly increased the effectiveness of Blind Justice against stronger enemies and even bosses. Regardless, Ramuh has some pretty impressive iconic abilities to make up for it. For starters, each enemy knocked down by one of his iconic abilities will have an extended recovery period of 8 seconds, which is 4 times as long as the standard recovery time. You can use this extended recovery period to your advantage by activating Blind Justice to target those enemies. Alternatively, you can quickly Phoenix Shift between the down enemies and execute a couple punishes, which you wouldn't be able to do without the extended recovery. Thunderstorm sends multiple contained lightning strikes down on an enemy before stunning them for 8 seconds. The range on this ability is pretty impressive, but if you execute it next to an enemy, they will get juggled within Ramuh's staff, dealing extra damage before being electrocuted and launched back in front of Clive for quick and easy follow-up attacks. Pile Drive is one of my favorite abilities in the game, purely for feel-good reasons and overall aesthetics. When activated, Clive slams Ramuh's staff into the ground, causing a lightning blast to resonate, knocking back all enemies within its radius. Its damage output is nothing to rave about, but it's the easiest and best AoE burst attack in the game up until you unlock Titan's Upheaval later on in the story. Ramuh's signature ability Judgment Bolt will be the strongest iconic ability for damage power at the point of unlocking it in the skill tree. You'll want to use it on fully staggered enemies with an active 1.5 damage multiplier for the most damage possible. And finally, Ramuh's Lightning Rod is slowly being recognized as one of the best abilities in the game as more and more players discover its capabilities. It's a one-of-a-kind support ability that really shines when being used in tandem with any multi-hit attack. Once placed, the Lightning Rod can be struck to create a localized burst of lightning that damages enemies caught in its radius. Clive can quickly follow up with a magic burst after the rod is placed, plus if an enemy strikes the rod themselves, the lightning blast will be strengthened through increased damage and a wider attack radius. This is a great feature for use against larger enemies with multi-hit attacks, as they'll constantly be damaging themselves from the blast resonating from the rod. Furthermore, the lightning rod can be repositioned during combat if an enemy gets knocked out of its radius, plus Clive can lock onto the rod and fire magic shots at it from a distance, or even use Blind Justice for attaching ball lightning to it and distant enemies. Clive can then trigger the discharge by melee striking the rod without even needing to get near the targeted enemies. And like mentioned earlier, quick multi-hit attacks benefit tremendously from Lightning Rod's support. Garuda's Gouge and Wicked Wheel, plus Ifrit's Will of the Wikes are the best early game multi-hit abilities to pair with it, and later game abilities like Titan's Raging Fist and Bahamut's Giga Flare will benefit the most since they have higher damage power. And lastly, you'll always want to try and have a Lightning Rod placed next to a fully staggered enemy, as it will help reach the 1.5 damage multiplier at a quicker rate. Using Garuda's Gouge on a staggered enemy without the Lightning Rod only increases the multiplier to 1.2. However, with the Lightning Rod's added damage, it increases the multiplier up to 1.4. Clive can then execute a quick ability like Pile Drive to max it out at 1.5 before raining down a massive Judgment Bolt. Ramuh's playstyle may be a bit unconventional, especially in contrast to the sheer speed of the first two iconic powers, but by looking a bit closer, you can start to see the possibility of a mage-style build with his Blind Justice and Lightning Rod. Keeping your distance from enemies is definitely the way to go with Ramuh, and once you unlock Bahamut later on in the game's story, you can combine their feats together for a more effective mage build, but more on that in a future video. If you made it here to the end, thank you so much, and I hope you found this video to be insightful insightful and informative. The next video will dive into the iconic powers of Titan, Bahamut, and Shiva, so if that's something you'd be interested in watching, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss that upload. And lastly, as always, thanks for tuning in today. I'll see you all in the next one.